All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone to this Kendall Hunt webinar, The Importance of Adding Trauma and Resilience to Your Criminal Justice Courses. How do you prepare criminal justice students for the real world challenges of criminal justice careers? And how do you do that in the context of a classroom? Well, that is what we're diving into today. But before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded. You'll receive access to that in the coming days. We will be taking chats and questions after the webinar. So if you have a question, please feel free to enter it in either the chat or the Q&A functions, and we will address those afterwards. But I'd love to start by introducing our wonderful speakers today. Dr. Denise Leifker offers an inside perspective on criminal justice, having worked across law enforcement, courts, corrections. Her research on Blue Courage training has been pivotal in reframing officer wellness, empathizing resilience, and the guardian-focused approach to professional development. And Dr. Carolyn Dallinger bridges academia and real-world advocacy. She brings depth from her experiences as a social justice worker, a human rights attorney, and a criminal justice professor. She has a multidisciplinary background that includes a PhD in sociology, a law degree, and she has been just committed to illuminating social justice issues and empowering students to drive meaningful change. And together, they bring a comprehensive expertise to understanding trauma and resilience in criminal justice education. So, couldn't be more excited to have you two with us today. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that awesome introduction. So yes, we are here to talk about the importance of adding trauma and resilience to your criminal justice courses. Like she mentioned, my name is Denise Leifker. I am an associate professor currently of criminal justice at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, and I will turn it over to Carolyn to introduce herself.
Yeah, I'm Carolyn Dallinger, Professor Emeritus. I have that wonderful standing now as I retired just over a year ago. Worked with Denise for many years, was a professor for 20, and as Megan nicely put our introductions, have also practiced as an attorney and a social worker. I have an MSW. So we want to get right into this issue, which is so extremely important to us. And let's see if I can make it. I can't get the slide to forward. Let's see if there's. There we go.
Goes.
Okay, we'll see if it works. So to start with this, we wanted to just give some information, which if you are professors or in the field, you probably have some of this knowledge already, but why is it important to include trauma and resilience in our teaching? And Denise and I, the more we've researched about this, talked about this, and even our interactions with our students, let alone in the field, see how important. We just think this is extremely important now for you to be thinking about and finding any way to get this into some of your courses. Some of our statistics we pulled out, this is one study from 2022, 96% of women and 89% of men somewhere in the criminal justice system have had significant trauma in early childhood to later in life. And as we know in the field itself, if you're looking at law enforcement, we know that vicarious trauma, even by witnessing it, not ourselves, but through others, secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue, while we have no compassion left in our work and in our jobs, can have lasting impacts on police officers if they ignore the symptoms that they are having. And one study reported that 63% of judges experience some symptoms of vicarious trauma in their work.
We also know from a study that 50% of jurors showed that serving on a jury caused them trauma-related symptoms. And one study showed that 53% of officers within correctional institutions, those included both rural and urban, reported post-traumatic stress disorder, which was linked to burnout due to exhaustion, cynicism, and ineffectiveness in their work. I remember a police officer coming and speaking to my students one day, and he gave an interesting stat that police officers experience 3.5 traumatic events for every 6 months of work that they experience. And of course, that is probably on the low end from being from a rural jurisdiction, but we know that it is very important to convey to our students.
So here are some of the reasons that we started our research in this area of trauma and resilience. First of all, in our textbooks that we had for our classes and the material, there were no good examples. It just, now maybe they talked a little bit about burnout occasionally, but no real emphasis on the trauma that is in the field. And quite frankly, we wouldn't have a criminal justice field without trauma. And so we really wanted to include that. We have both in teaching a master's in criminal justice and now a certificate in trauma and resilience. So even with that kind of information, we weren't finding good examples. And then of course, we wanted to prepare our students for trauma that if they haven't been in the field yet, that they would encounter in their criminal justice careers.
We also think it's really important to help existing practitioners recognize the trauma that they encounter and begin to talk openly about it. So historically, it's been very common to sort of stuff these experiences and just move on. And it's really important to recognize it, name it, identify, and be able to talk about it openly and not feel ashamed. We also think it's important to encourage avenues to help those going into the field and those already in the field build avenues of resilience, self-care, those types of things. And then we also did interviews and want to be able to share those stories with the interviewees because we found a lot of common themes among the people that we interviewed in the field on trauma and resilience. As we prepared to write the book, we first were reflecting on some of our own experiences in the field and some of the trauma that we encountered ourselves. One example that came to mind to me when I was thinking about this was I spent a lot of time writing pre-sentence investigation reports, and I had a case assigned to me that was a voluntary manslaughter case where an 18-year-old white man in California had killed a 23-year-old black man. The original charge was first-degree murder, but the jury ended up deciding on manslaughter. The case stuck with me because that homicide occurred about 2 blocks from where I lived personally, and I could play that whole scene out in my mind, learning about this from the reports. To me, it seemed like these were just 2 young kids who had gotten into a disagreement over drugs and theft. The black man showed up at a party, and the white man shot him point blank in the face. No matter what the exact circumstances were, I was responsible for meeting with the victim's parents, and they had lost their son, and that grief for them was real. They were sad, they were angry, they were lost. The mother kept crying in my office that she wanted her baby back. I kept thinking to myself, how could this happen? We were just 2 small kids in a young kids in a small town, and now lives are forever changed. I saw the pictures of the body in the report, the pictures of the crime scene. I like to jog on a regular basis, so I would find myself running past that house and replaying this scene in my mind. I just kept replaying it. I ended up recommending 15 years for the individual that was the shooter. The judge sentenced him to 11, but eventually through appeals, he got 7.5. Interesting how our legal system works, of course. There are a lot of details that impacted that sentence, but I really believed the individual needed to do time, but he ended up not doing much time at all, and the victim is never going to come back. So all of that really resonated with me. I struggled with so many different aspects of it. The fact that they were so young, the fact that one was gone, the fact that one's life would forever be changed by their experience with incarceration, the victim's trauma, my own trauma and experiencing this and having to deal with it. And it was just one of those things that, again, encouraged our desire to write a book about this topic.
Yeah, and I also reflected back, as I mentioned in the intro. I started out as a social worker, and this was probably right after I graduated from undergrad. And I worked at a domestic violence shelter. And of course, if you know anything about domestic violence, a lot of the research says that a victim will need to leave and probably go back into the situation at least 7 times. I think that's the average before they can make a break. And there was one woman that we worked with, I'll call her Patty, and she had been in the shelter before, and I was coming in, but I'd left, and I was coming in one morning, and there was Patty, right as I came in, and I said, Patty, what has happened? And she just looked at me and just lost it and got through the message that her husband had lit fire to their home where her mother was at the time with the two grandkids, and they all died in that story. And I was really traumatized, I guess I will say that, at the time. And now, just kind of going back through it, have goosebumps when I think back to that. Another time as an attorney, we were taking on a very large case that was in the media, and it was just at the turn to 2000, and it was a male on male sexual harassment. Several plaintiffs, men who had been sexually harassed by their boss, even touching in the penis area. And of course, the media got a hold of it. The judge was not very forthcoming, didn't allow witnesses to come through. And um, every night it was with the media, it was awful. And the way they were, really just raking these guys over the coals. And I just remember my stomach was upset. I would vomit, headaches every day. So these issues of trauma and resilience are real. Even in our past experiences in the field connected to criminal justice or in criminal justice really brought this home to us, that this is such an important topic that we need to keep working towards. And I want to share one writing from Sergeant Annie Smith, which is a pseudonym, but she works in a police department that's a medium-sized town, about 50,000 folks in the town. And here's what she said about it. She said, in August 2021, one of my close friends lost her 13-year-old son to suicide. My friend works for the fire department. The fire department did not have a peer support team. My chief agreed to allow our team to step in and assist. I responded to the home where her son died by suicide. I spent hours with my friend and fellow first responder. Days and weeks and months went by and I became exhausted. I was exhausting every bit of compassion I had, and it led to fatigue. I had to work through this in therapy and have learned a lot about myself in the process. Shortly after my friend's son's death, I responded to a homicide. The female victim was still warm to the touch, and I wanted to save her. I remember yelling at the other officers on scene and asking for them to come help me get her on the ground so I could start medical treatment. My supervisor skills finally set in and I stopped. I took a deep breath and asked everyone to give me a second. I turned on the lights and found that the female had dozens of gunshot wounds, and there was nothing I could do to save the young woman. There was nothing anyone could do. Vicarious trauma is real. I have experienced it and have worked through it. So this was another example of how much trauma is experienced in the criminal justice field. And as she mentioned, as the sergeant mentioned, had she not continued to do self-help and get help for that, she probably would not be in the field anymore.
So in this particular slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the direct connection for trauma and resilience to law enforcement. So number one, you want to be able to relate and help victims and offenders who have experienced trauma. So we know that 90% plus of offenders and victims have had trauma in their lives. That is a common theme that runs through the offenders and the victims that we deal with in the criminal justice system. To be able to recognize trauma when you experience firsthand, so know that what you're experiencing is traumatic, know what those symptoms are, know what those signs are. Number three, to recognize the impact of vicarious trauma. So to know that when you hear stories over and over or hear repetitive stories of trauma in others, it can be trauma for yourself. And that's that concept of vicarious trauma. Number four, to be able to build resilience in those you work with and yourself. So being able to help the offenders that we know and the victims that we know have experienced trauma build resilience, if you happen to be a caseworker or law enforcement or corrections, all of those areas, and also be able to build it in yourself through self-care. And then just to be prepared for all of this in the field that you enter, the students may have no idea that this is a part of what they are going to be experiencing. It's a great field to work in. It's an awesome field to work in, but it does have some things to be aware of. So know that this is all coming at you. So this can be in law enforcement. You think about victims, offenders, police officers, detectives, crime scene techs, analysts, coroners, medical examiners, all of the people that might be coming on scene related to law enforcement. As far as some study questions that might be helpful for students in a textbook type of situation is, how can trauma experienced by victims and offenders influence their relationships with the police? So police officers being aware of what trauma might look like, even though it's masked as something else: anger, resentment, disassociation, those types of things. And then number two, what results may happen for law enforcement officers when facing reoccurring trauma in the field. It can look like poor relationships with others. It can be stress, loss of sleep, heart attacks. My dad was in law enforcement. He has had 2 heart attacks. That is real. And I can say that I say quote from the field, after experiencing traumatic events, I mostly just moved on. That was a common theme with all the law enforcement officers I spoke to, is that it's just part of the job. Now, most of them are not in the field anymore, or have left the field. So they knew it was a part of it, and either they couldn't take it anymore or it was in the past. But knowing that it's part of your job and figuring out ways to make yourself better and build some resilience is really important.
So then, looking at the need to connect trauma and resilience to the court system, kind of the second part of our 3-part system in criminal justice. And within this area, we really need to help relate to the victims and offenders who experience trauma. This is true in the courtroom with judges, with attorneys, whether they're prosecutors, defense attorneys, as witnesses, etc. It's very important that they relate to it. And as I mentioned early on in this webinar, the percentages of both victims and offenders is so high in our system, somewhere around the 95%, that we know we're working with people that have experienced trauma, and then how do we work with them through this experience. And of course, being through the court system, whether it's prosecution or other kinds of court cases, is also traumatic for individuals if they have to, testify again to the trauma that they experienced as a victim. And even offenders are traumatized as they go through our system. Another one is to recognize trauma when you experience it firsthand. And all personnel within the court system, as I was doing a lot of the research and interviewing, particularly judges, experience trauma and the stress through the cases that they hearing the firsthand testimony from victims or even offenders, having graphic videos, pictures, other kinds of evidence within the courtroom itself can develop into vicarious trauma for judges. And so that's kind of like the trial judges. Appellate judges, the stress that they experience was a little bit different. Of course, they often do read the trial transcript from below, but they also are making very difficult decisions sometimes. And sometimes those are out in the public. The media takes a hold of those decisions, and there might be a lot of stress and the kind of impact from the community about the decisions, and sometimes even threats. We've heard that in more recent years, that judges become threatened, even at the appellate or Supreme Court level. So understanding those firsthand experiences is important. Also, to recognize the impact of vicarious trauma on yourself as well as others. And during that, we also want to build resilience in those who work within the system, within yourselves, if you're going into the system. It was even mentioned in some of the research about jurors. Now, jurors are required to come and serve when they are called forth. If they don't show up for jury duty, then the judge can do a bench warrant. I mean, this is required within our system of justice. They are not trained to deal with the kind of trauma that they might experience as they're sitting in that jury. And so we need to think about some of those thoughts. And jurors that were interviewed, or even other kinds of research that I found, they can talk about having intrusive thoughts, hyperarousal, depression, restless sleep, feeling isolated, headaches, etc. And so it's very important that judges learn how to work with the jurors in the system. And they've developed some mitigating kinds of techniques that they can use. They often might discuss with the jury ahead of time what kind of cases is going to be, especially if it's a very traumatic case, traumatic injury, or very highly publicized case, then it's even more difficult for jurors. They might say things like when they have to pass evidence around the jury box. If it's like pictures, just look at it once and turn it over. You don't have to just stare at repeatedly, or they might limit the number of times that a lawyer can show a very graphic video, etc. So they're learning to use some of these resilience techniques to help folks. And then to prepare to be entering the field, judges, lawyers, court officials, victims, offenders, jurors, all of these folks can experience trauma. The judges, they now have what they might call a trauma-informed courtroom, and maybe some of you are familiar with this, but judges will really even physically organize their courtroom so that they can work with the victims. Especially if children are involved, they might reorganize it so that they are more on a level field with the children. You know, often in the courtroom, you look way up high on the judge, like they're the high almighty, but they're really trying to find ways, slowing down the process so all the people involved can really understand what's going on. And in our system of justice, it's a fast moving pace. And so it takes money and it takes time to slow down some of these kinds of things, but it's very important to help lessen the kind of trauma that folks are experiencing. Additionally, some of the law firms are now trying to become trauma informed. Also having people at your same level. So if it's a district judge that's hearing firsthand cases, really having that kind of feedback from other judges at that level, or lawyers within their field, really getting that kind of feedback and talking about the trauma that they're experienced. So some of the things that in many of these folks that were interviewed talked about to develop resilience, they needed self-care skills, discussing with others, sleep and exercise and eating right, all those things that we know are so important. But when we're in a stressful field, this is even more important to really think and plan for those things. A couple of study questions that we came up with was, how can judges or other court officials recognize the vicarious trauma that they may be experiencing? Again, as Denise mentioned, a lot of these folks, victims, offenders that have been repeatedly traumatized, they're not necessarily happy-go-lucky people. And sometimes it's very difficult to work with folks, but even starting to understand what trauma does to the body is really helpful for those that are working in the field. And then how might judges minimize the trauma jurors might experience with some of the examples that I already gave. One of the quotes from the field was this: I was preparing a victim for trial. This is a county prosecutor. And I realized as I showed him the video of himself being shot, he had not seen it before and started crying. I had to give him time to regroup. So these are the kind of things that prosecutors can start to learn from.
The last section of the criminal justice system is corrections. So those same concepts are repeated up at the top. So to be able to relate and help victims and offenders who have experienced trauma, by the time you get to the correctional system, it's likely years of built up trauma masking as something else. So to be able to relate to them and help them work through that and recognize it for what it is. And then to recognize trauma when you experience it firsthand. So for correctional officers, they may be witness to a riot. They may be witness to attacks in the jail, suicides that are happening, mental health breakdowns among the people that they are working with, manipulation by individuals that they're working with. These are also times to recognize trauma, to recognize the impact of vicarious trauma, hearing stories of those that have been in the system for years and have many, many, many failed attempts at success, many horrible stories of their background and how they ended up in the correctional system. To be able to build resilience in those that you work with and yourself. So build resilience in offenders or clients to help them have more success in the future through programming, through being trauma informed. There's a women's facility where we live that is much better at being trauma informed, probably than some of the men's facilities. But one of the things they have is a rocking chair room, where the women just sit, and sometimes that gets them talking. It is soothing, it helps them decompress and maybe start talking about what's really going on rather than what they're masking and what it's looking like on the surface. And then again, to be preparing our students to be working in these fields, knowing ahead of time that some of this is going to come with the job, but also be able to focus on celebrating the successes of clients and be prepared for the worst. But I will say that working in corrections was one of my favorite jobs. You know that you're working with individuals that have been traumatized, but success can be really powerful, and just helping them with the little successes. And part of that is recognizing all of the trauma and victimization that they might have been a part of can be really empowering in the job as well. As far as example study questions, what can be done to build resilience among those working in the corrections field? Some of that self-care, being trauma-informed, doing appropriate trainings. How might correctional officers understand offenders' behavior due to their early trauma? So again, recognizing what that might look like on the surface that is actually something else underneath. And then a quote from the field. It was a supervisor working at a county probation facility that said, "I see vicarious trauma in almost all of my coworkers. Many have breakdowns because we see and hear it all. It's a lot." Like I mentioned, sometimes these services can be better for women. We see women as victims more often, but all of the offenders or clients, depending on what we're calling them in what particular situation, have most all of them have trauma, and it's really important to try to be trauma informed in all aspects, men, women, and a variety of different populations, children, and all of that.
So Denise and I, through all this research, we did put together a book. And I guess our number one thing to say to everyone is that we just hope you include trauma and resilience in whatever courses that you have. If it's just a little bit, you do your own research or whatever. We feel that this is so important in our field, and we hope more and more professors and instructors really start to utilize this. But the book that we developed, it kind of goes along, and different courses could use it differently. We really saw it as a supplement. Like we said, we were looking for something that could give us examples and, interviews and information directly from those in the field. So say an intro to criminal justice, there's actually throughout, because you look at all three different parts of the criminal justice system. Or if we have a policing course, there's chapter 2 is like an overview, and then a later chapter goes through very specific examples, trauma and resilience in law enforcement. Similarly, in courts, we have a courts and sentencing course that you could utilize, again, an overview and a very specific chapter. And then correctional practices, we have courses in there, or maybe you have intro to correctional services folks, but course, but there we have an overview and then also very specific chapters. But however you do it, we really encourage you to include this within some of your teaching.
The next slide is on a what I call a book to self paper assignment. So it would be an option to use this as an assignment to have the book as a reading in addition to maybe another reading in your course or another textbook. So you would have the students read Trauma and Resilience in the Criminal Justice System book, reflect on what they read, and connect to a traumatic experience that they have had. If that's too difficult for them, they could connect to a traumatic experience of someone they know. With this assignment, they would take that experience and link it to 4 specific topics discussed within the text, 2 related to trauma and 2 related to resilience. Text itself, the idea is that it's an opportunity to become introspective about what they've read and compare it to their own life, ultimately leading to growth. They would include at least 2 outside scholarly sources to provide additional context to these connections, so finding their own outside scholarly research on trauma and resilience, and conclude by demonstrating how they have grown or what they have grown in from this experience. And if the example did not include the criminal justice system, maybe they could make that a connection to something that they have experienced that could be similar to something that someone in the criminal justice could have experienced. So when I told that story about the 18-year-old individual that was shot and the 23-year-old individual that was going to spend time in custody, you could connect to trauma of the law enforcement officers responding to the scene, connecting to the trauma of the family of the victim, feeling maybe traumatized also by the sentence that the offender received not being fair, connecting it to corrections and what life is going to be like for an individual that loses 7 years of their life in custody. Reentry, what's that going to be like? How could we help with this process? This individual killed someone. He needs to be rehabilitated, punished, all sorts of goals of sentencing, but also experiencing trauma that he might have experienced previously or as part of this offense. And then connecting to outside sources and trying to build a large paper that allows for that future growth in understanding the concepts of trauma and resilience.
We want to wrap up now, but we just really want to emphasize the importance of this area in your courses. And it's really vitally important for folks to recognize this is a big part of the criminal justice system, to understand it, normalize it within the system, within themselves and within others within this system, and also implement those kinds of resilience techniques that will help them continue in the system and be productive. And we hope that this research really helps open those doors for students or folks in the field right now.
Oh, sorry. And then we would love to have your feedback if there is anything that we could do to continue growing our research and making it even better in future editions of the book. And we're open to making any connections that we could to help you in your courses or in your departments or whatever we might be able to do to help sell the idea of how important trauma and resilience really is to the field and to students getting ready to enter the field.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. That was just jam-packed with so much information about how you really can connect the topics of trauma and resilience to each of those three spheres in the criminal justice system. A couple of questions that I had, and if anyone in our audience today has questions, like feel free to enter them either in the chat or the Q&A function. But I'm curious, have you noticed a difference in students entering the professional sphere who maybe have been prepared with some of these ideas versus those who aren't? I don't know if that's something you've been able to observe.
Yeah, I think hearing back from, like I said, we have a graduate program, and some of the folks are, most of them are already in the field. Some are just new coming on from undergrad. But we hear back from them pretty regularly and talk about how understanding some of this information is so critical to their jobs. I remember one, she was a police officer, and she said that their police department, the chief of the police department, had really taken on trauma and the kinds of resilience that's needed. And they're trying to implement it department-wide, and how important it was. She had studied some of this, and so she was kind of the chief person that was put in charge to help with the rest of the department. So not only did she learn her own techniques, but was able to then start training and teaching others the importance of this. And they had their own groups to really talk through traumatic events. And she said it was very, very helpful for their department.
Wow. I would imagine too that since these topics and techniques are becoming more and more ingrained in the criminal justice system, that by preparing students with them, kind of like you said, Dr. Dallinger, that you're really kind of enabling them to be forerunners in the field and leaders leading in these topics. Do you find when you have these first conversations with incoming students, are they generally surprised, or I'm assuming they've got some idea that they're going into probably a difficult field, but when you really like get into like the meat and bones of this, do you find that they're kind of surprised by what you're sharing with them?
I think that students maybe don't think about it until we raise the issue, but then when presented with it, I think they find it to be helpful information. Like, wow, I never thought about it that way. I'm glad that I know that ahead of time. You know, like it's not rocket science, but it's something that's just not really talked about or not really thought about. Maybe more in the human services professions they think about it, but I think criminal justice, maybe it's just more of a duty rather than something that they expect to be encountering.
Yeah, and I think like some of the assignments that I've given in the trauma and resilience certificate, they have to actually write out a self-care plan before they're done with the course. And they've come back and said they might not, really go with that all the time, but it's there for them. And they have referred back to that when they feel the stress really piling on. So I agree with what you're saying, Megan. We've actually seen where this can be a benefit to students having some of this knowledge and skills to be sought after within the field itself. Because you mentioned it is upcoming, but it's still very far and few from what we can see. Maybe Denise sees something different, but there's still a lot of need for more places to become informed that are out in the field itself.
Yeah, I think we're excited by the sprinkling of hearing it, but it's not like commonplace.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And then so that it even more just kind of prevents students from being blindsided when they do get in the field then, which I would imagine would be very, very powerful to a new professional. I wanted to pivot real quick to your book because it really is just like such an excellent resource. So say maybe some of our listeners, they're hearing this and they're thinking, oh my goodness, I want to include this in my course yesterday. But I'm in the semester or I don't necessarily have time to just like redo all of my lesson plans. Well, I think part of what's really helpful is that your book's a supplement. And so they can include this with what's already being done. But if for a professor just trying to get started with including some of this stuff, what would you guys suggest?
Well, I think we all, of course, all of us would love to have a full course on trauma and resilience, but knowing budgets, knowing universities and colleges, it's just rare. There might be occasion, we have what's called a May term, where you might have a one topic course that you could really delve into. Other than that, we're pretty restricted on the courses that are required, the ones that we have to teach. So I think that what a person could do, the way the book is organized, it really cuts apart the different systems. And we know our system is just not cut and dried in three areas, but it helps to kind of hone into something by looking at those different parts. I think also when, faculty jobs, we are more and more pulled in different ways. Um, Lots of more assignments that we have to do. And so doing all that background research is really hard on top of all the other assignments that we have. So this kind of brings at least some starting of the research that is out there. What are some of the best techniques being used that you could talk to students about, or even folks in the field? Maybe a police department is trying to start some of this, and so they want to get kind of a head start on what are some of the best practices out there. What are some things that we should be looking for? So I think you can kind of spot pick some areas out of the book as well as in the way that it is organized.
I also think it's a really quick and easy read. So if you ask students to read it, I don't think it is too overwhelming. Or if you were to read it yourself and pick out the parts that you thought were most relevant to students, it's a nice, easy read, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know you two mentioned that some of for as far as like assignments and things like that, like there's groundwork already done. There's these study questions. There's these, uh, the paper assignment, and so that's a nice aspect too.
And there's
Yeah,
PowerPoint.
Yeah, PowerPoints,
Test
quizzes,
banks, I think.
yeah,
Oh,
that come
excellent.
with the book. So we've done that, and I'm actually teaching it right now it's a joint class, undergrads and graduates. And right off the bat, an undergrad student, probably not a grad, but an undergrad student was like, wow, I had no idea what all police go through in their job. So just even understanding that as a supplement to, the other kinds of major things they're learning about the system really seemed to peak for this one student at least.
Wow, that is amazing. Well, and what it really comes down to is like you're equipping students to thrive in these fields because someone needs to do these jobs. Like it's needed. And so, the more prepared students can be for success, not just from a success standpoint, but also for like a personal thriving standpoint, like I think that's incredibly powerful. But thank you so much for presenting with us today. Everyone who attended, thank you so much. Like I said before, this is recorded. We'll be sending that out in a couple of days. If you have any questions, feel free to email Kendall Hunt Publishing. If you would like to request a copy of the book, your screen's going to naturally redirect when you close out of the webinar, and you'll be able to request a complimentary copy to take a look at, give us your feedback. We would love to hear. Thank you again, Dr. Leifker and Dr. Dallinger, for presenting with us today. It was truly a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah.
Absolutely. And everyone else, you have a wonderful day wherever you're at. Stay warm. We'll see you next time.